When I was about 15, I went on a cruise with my parents around Asia. One night, I was making my way back to the kids' club. My mom insisted that I join so I could meet new people. After changing into my swimsuit at my cabin, it was around midnight, and since around 90% of the people on the ship were elderly, they were already in bed, so everywhere we went was empty. My cabin was on the lowest level of the ship, whereas the pool was on the top deck, so I had a fair ways to get there. After waiting for one of the 6 elevators to open for 5 minutes, I got impatient and ran for the stairs. That's when I heard "Are you running away from me?" I turned around, and a man who looked to be in his late 20s and dressed from head to toe in gray was grinning at me. Unsure of how to act, I gave him a slight smile and tried to keep walking, but he moved fast and blocked my path. He asked me all the questions like, "What's your name? How old are you? Where are you from? Why are you so uncomfortable around me?" But I managed to lie and say my parents were waiting for me, and before he answered, I walked away, and then ran when I couldn't see him. At about 1:30 to 2, I said goodbye to my new friends and started to head towards the stairs again, and guess who I ran into? The man was coming up the stairs when I was about to go down, and as soon as he spotted me, he grinned. He was purposefully blocking my way, and his questions were getting more and more personal. He kept telling me I had a pretty smile, and that I was beautiful, and that he offered to walk me to my cabin. At this point, my gut was telling me to get away, and fast. That was the second time I ran into him, and it was on the same floor. I began to think that his cabin was on that floor, and was worrying what he could do. Every time he said something, I replied with, "I have to go," and eventually, I could see he was getting angry. This went on for several minutes. More questions, more compliments, some touching. I pushed him off, and he hit the wall beside us once I wasn't giving him the answers he wanted. But then, he took a deep breath and smiled at me. I was beginning to get really scared, so I turned around, ran through the glass doors behind the pool deck, and collided with one of the boys from the club. I began to panic, convinced that he was coming after me. I was talking too fast and hyperventilating, and my friend had no idea what was going on. I turned around to point at the man, but he wasn't there anymore. I told my parents what happened, which led to my dad walking me to the club every night, and my mom was determined to find out who he was, so she and I went to the little photo shop on one of the decks and looked through the mandatory photos that each passenger had to take before they got on the ship. He wasn't in a single photo. I never saw him again after that. It was as if he wasn't even on the boat. I still wonder what could have happened if I hadn't ran away and found my friend. And I also still wonder whether or not he was real. Besides, no one but me saw him on the ship. When I was around 10 years old, my family took a trip to Egypt. It was a sort of half cruise down the Nile River. We would stay often in various spots and check out things, and I don't think we honestly actually traveled on the boat very far. It's where our rooms were, though. My memory is a bit shaky on the finer points, as it was almost 20 years ago, but I do remember lots of cool things we went to see and do. The Great Pyramids of Egypt, riding a camel, museums, mummies, etc. But I also remember a lot of not fun things. Like the tour guide telling my family that my mother and I could never be ourselves without either our male family members or others from our tour group. They told us that the men in the country would see a single woman as someone seeking sex, as they would travel alone otherwise. Or another guy who offered my father a herd of camels for me, and a bit less for my mother as she was older. On the top of the ship we were staying at, there was a swimming pool. One morning I was using it, sporting a one-piece bathing suit. There was a boat driving past that was full of men. They were hooting and hollering and applauding and making a general ruckus as they could see me. And I put on theatrics because of it, diving into the pool, strutting around, loving my attention. I cringe at this now. Years later, my mother told me how in a store that was selling souvenirs on the shore, she was groped by the seller. He was placing a necklace on her, and then he started groping her. She told my father, and he shrugged it off at the time, and she was still mad at him over it. I understand, I would too. And to this day, I remember the one morning my parents went to go watch the sunrise over the desert. It required a very early wake-up, and my brother and I declined to go. So while my parents were out in the desert looking at the sun, my brother was still sleeping, and I decided to go to the pool. This may have been the same day that I was catcalled, since I was at the pool area by myself, but I'm not 100% sure. I do remember that on the top of this ship, there was a hatch going down one level near the pool. That day, I eyed it and decided I had to know where it went. It was easy to open, and I climbed down a sort of ladder to the deck below. This deck was still open to the outside, with the doors leading to the compartments and such. The way the boat was, we were a couple of ships out from the port. To get off the boat, you'd have to traverse to other ships in between, but I think this was a normal thing. They were all lined up together, and the travelers would simply disembark by going through the various ships until they reached the shore. I went right, and I reached the ladder bottom, noticing the major differences from the other areas of the boat I had been on. This area was dirtier, and there were ropes and other junk lying around. I found where the kitchens were, and I stood a while looking through the window. I remember it seeming rather gross looking in there, which redoubled my desire to never eat there. My family already decided not to eat on the boat when a waiter visibly sweat onto the soups he served us. I went back towards where the ladder was, then I continued for a bit. From this vantage, I could see all the ships between ours and the shore. I think there was around 3 or 4 total. I noticed on the far ship that a man was hopping over the railings and coming towards me, one boat at a time, versus coming through the main area, which had been set up for the tourists to easily get through all the ships and to the shore. I backed up a bit, backing towards the ladder as I realized he was making a beeline towards me. He came over the railing, and I don't remember exactly what he said to me, but it was an introduction in a heavy English accent. He asked me if I wanted to party. I was a little confused. In my head, party is when my parents had friends over and lots of music and dancing. I like parties. Sometimes I got to stay up late and dance too. I don't remember exactly how he convinced me, but I remember standing in the open doorway to the cabin, and then he started inviting me in. It smelled like smoke, and there was a haze all throughout the room. There were 3 men in there. I don't know what it's called. The long flowing dress like shirts they wear, with the headgear as well, sitting and smiling at me and waving their hands. A hookah nearby them, and bottles everywhere. Outside the room the sun was shining and everything was bright and lit up. In there was an underlying smell I couldn't place, and the blinds were all shut, giving the room a reddish look. Out of everything, that memory is most vivid. I remember looking up at the smiling mustache man standing in the doorway. He wasn't intimidating, actually a bit scrawny. He had a good smile that didn't seem off. My little pubescent brain did light up though. I went, I'm pretty sure this is one of those situations that I'm not supposed to be in, and I really need to go. So I booked it. I skedaddled to the ladder. It wasn't that far. I didn't look back a single time. I just got up the ladder as fast as I could and ran back to our room. My brother was in where he was sleeping. I told my parents after they returned, and they made a complaint, but nothing ever came of it. The room in question was just a crew member's lounge or something. I never saw any of those guys again, though. My parents left Egypt disgruntled. I never really thought about it again until a few years later when I was older. Would I be dead by now? Sold into a sex ring? Married to some Egyptian guy with a bunch of kids by now? It makes me shudder to even think about it, and very grateful that my school did cover a little bit, but not enough about stranger danger. It was enough to make me reject the very friendly guy and realize this was a bad situation for me to be in. With all the weird situations that happened on that trip, and the fascination I apparently held for being so young, I can't help but think that something terrible would have happened if I had gone into that room. I'm a very avid sailor and have many creepy stories pertaining to my travels, and I hope to be able to share some more of them. This one occurred a few months back on the Potomac River in the United States. We had been doing a cruise that weekend to visit 2 of the 4 islands in the lower Potomac that weekend. The forecast had been for good wind, but unfortunately it was dead calm. We were planning on visiting some more remote islands, St. Clement's first, and then sailing to the upper river to Cobb Island, which is populated, to tie up and stay for the night. With the wind being as it was, we had to give up on attempting to sail and begin motoring. We cut the glassy surface smoothly. The second boat, that used a small gas outboard engine, threw its fuel tank, forcing us to stop in Cobb Island first. We modified the itinerary to stay at St. Clement's instead, which would prove to be a quite uncomfortable experience. We soon set back off from Cobb and plied up the smooth river to St. Clement's. The diesel on the boat I was skimpering is old and moody, so in the heat of the day, which was 90 plus, it began to overheat and have issues. I solved this by slowing the revolutions on the engine, reducing us to a slow crawl, pushing back our arrival to the night. Fine, it really wasn't a problem. We arrive and tie up at the end of the ferry pier, a moderately sized pier about 100 yards long on the northeast side. It's getting dark at this point and we are restless, so we set off to explore this pile of sand. We travel down the east side of the island on a grass clearing access road. It's a new moon, so it's pitch black, and we do not have lights. After walking for 10 or 15 minutes, we see a fire in the distance and hear voices. We walk towards it and make out a group of 6 drunks, which is odd since we hadn't seen any boats. They called out to us, but we walked past, paying them no never mind. We reach the south shore and still see no boat, which was odd. The island itself is pretty eerie, with an old lighthouse and a massive cross on it. We decided to return to the boat to retire for the night. Passing by the group again, they are wrestling and begin to ask us to come over. We decline, however, and they get belligerent. We begin to walk briskly, and 2 of them start following us. We're worried, as I had left my knife back in the boat, and these guys were pretty large. We broke into a sprint to get back to the boat, and the men began to run as well, but they soon gave up. We reached the boat to attempt to leave the island, and we tried to turn the diesel over, but the old motor had given it all she could for the day and wouldn't start. A fresh breeze had come up, but it was coming from the wrong direction to sail off. We were stuck on the island with these feral drunks. This is when we started hearing voices and seeing lights moving up the east side of the island. We froze and decided to try and go silent. We extinguished all the lights and stayed quiet, but the waves are making quite the racket with the boat. The lights reached the base of the pier and disappeared, but the voices remain. They stayed at the base of the pier and would not move back down the shore, so we set up a watch system, and most of the crew went to sleep. You could hear the bastards walk around the pier and hit stuff with some hard objects and break a bottle or 2. It continued through the night and then disappeared as dawn broke. In the morning, we searched the island for them and just found broken glass and embers from their fire. Nothing else.